All right, everyone, welcome to our One Thing monthly webinar for September of 2018. Very excited to be here with you all today. We've got an incredible guest for you. We've brought him on once before. It was an incredible interview, and many people emailed us said, please bring this guy back. And he's got a brand new book coming out called Atomic Habits, which you can learn more by going to atomichabits.com. Goes live October 16th. You can pre-order now. And here's the reason that we're having this conversation. One of my personal favorite quotes from The One Thing is the quote from F.M. Alexander that people do not decide their futures, they decide their habits, and their habits decide their futures. And one of the amazing gifts of being in business with a guy like Gary Keller is you get to literally stare at a person who has achieved extraordinary levels of success and ask the question, what habits did Gary acquire that made Gary Keller Gary Keller? And that has spun off so many ideas and 66-day challenges that I have gone on because we know that it's really not about the result. It's about the person that you become, how you evolve over time. And so that's the purpose of why we're having this conversation here today. The person that you are going to meet has built a career focused on helping people create better habits, make better decisions, and live better lives. He's combined ideas from a wide range of disciplines, including biology, neuroscience, psychology, physiology, and more. He believes that you do not rise to the level of your goals, you rather fall to the level of your systems. I'll say that again. You do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. He's been featured all over the place, including the New York Times, Entrepreneur, Time, CBS This Morning, just to name the few, and the One Thing podcast, of course. Which, out of curiosity, how many of you have listened to the One Thing podcast before? If so, put me in the chat box, and if not, do a little question mark. This is an episode that will go live on the podcast after the fact, and I would strongly encourage many of you. We had an episode that went live this week with Brindley Tucker. Just go listen to it. I think it's one of the best ones we've done, period. So I would strongly recommend that you check that out. So with that, I'm excited to welcome on our guest today, Mr. James Clear. James, I'm sending you over the webcam request, and I just unmuted you. Can you hear me?
Hey, how's it going?
Good, man. Amazing. Thank you so much for being here. So you've had an incredible career in this space. What inspired you to write Atomic Habits?
Oh, well, thank you. I feel like I'm just getting started, so hopefully I have a long career ahead of me as well. Habits are incredibly important. The F.M. Alexander quote that you just shared, people do not design their lives or choose their lives, they choose their habits, and that leads to their lives and their outcomes and their results. I think that's true. And the interesting thing is that we're building habits all the time, whether you're thinking about it or not. I mean, if you are a human, you have all kinds of habits. And so the question that kind of came to my mind is, well, if we're building these things all the time anyway, and they make up such an important, large portion of our lives, is there any way that you can take control of that process and maybe design them to your liking and to be the architect of your habits rather than the victim of them? And so I think you can, perhaps not in every single circumstance, but certainly quite often. And the purpose of writing Atomic Habits was to come up with a system that people could employ in a variety of contexts for building good habits and breaking bad ones.
Yeah. One of the things I know you talk about in the book that I absolutely loved is this idea of if you could just get 1% better every day, how that would compound remarkably over time. And the setting I'll leave for the people who are listening to this, if you think, for those of you who are watching or listening right now, over the last 5 years, how many truly life-changing positive power habits have you formed in the last 5 years combined? Go ahead and put your answer in the chat box. I'd be really curious. We're not talking about just a little habit. Life-changing positive power habits. How many have you formed in the last 5 years combined? Lissy says, none. I see 1, 2, 2 to 3, 2 to 3, 1, 2. Yeah. It seems like whenever we ask this question, the average is always somewhere between 0 and 2. And I would ask the question, is that because you try to form more than one habit at a time? James, what is this idea of just getting 1% better every day?
Well, the way that I mean, the common way to think about any compounding process is with a financial example. So, saving for retirement or compound interest, and you don't really see a whole lot. It's basically a flat line for many years, and then slowly it starts to build, and then you hit this hockey stick curve, and it really takes off. And I think that habits are sort of the compound interest of self-improvement, in the same way that money can multiply and compound over time as you save it across the decades. The effects of your habits multiply and compound as you go through life. So, it's really easy to overlook the choice of doing something 1% better or 1% worse on a given day. Like the difference between studying Spanish for 10 minutes tonight or not studying at all isn't really that much. Like you don't know the language at the end of the night either way. The difference between going to the gym or not going to the gym, your body looks basically the same in the mirror. The difference between eating a burger and fries at lunch or eating a salad, the scale is basically the same at the end of the day. It's really only 2 or 5 or 10 years later that the full effect, the true outcome of your daily choices and those 1% better, 1% worse decisions becomes fully apparent. And so I think it's incredibly important to understand how habits work and how to design them, because they can be this double-edged sword. They can either compound for you or against you. And so if you know how they work and how to shape them to your liking, then you can avoid the dangerous half of the blade, so to speak. And it's really this idea that habits compound over time that kind of captured my attention and made me think about it more, because once you fully understand that concept, you start to realize how important the daily choices are that you make. They suddenly become things that you don't want to overlook. And of course, this is exactly counter to the societal narrative, because the news and society and social media is in some forms an entertainment show. It needs to show you things that have results. It needs to show you outcomes, because that's what's interesting. So you almost never hear about the process. Like there isn't a story about like guy chooses to eat chicken and salad for lunch again today. The story is like 8 months later when he's lost 50 pounds. Like you never hear about the process. The story is not like entrepreneur made 11 sales calls again. The story only comes years later when it's like, oh, finally have $1 million business. So we're a very outcome focused society. And so because of that, it's very easy to overlook the process and the importance of those 1% changes on a daily basis. But I also think it's why habits are so important.
Yeah. How many of you who are on here have found yourself wanting to go out and form multiple habits simultaneously, and you couldn't do it all, and every day you felt like a failure, so you just stopped trying? If so, put me in the chat box, and my hand is certainly raised for that one. I love what you're saying here, James, because the truth is, if you can just trust that domino effect, that if every day you just 1% better, just continue to choose the chicken salad, go to the gym, whatever it may be, you're not going to see it in the short term, but over the long run, really exponential results.
This is something that in Atomic Habits, I refer to this as kind of the plateau of latent potential, and the idea is that 1% improvements, they're hard to stick with over the long run, because you think that when you put effort in, you should see like a linear result for it. So the example that I give is, imagine that you're in a room and it's very cold, you can see your breath, and you have like an ice cube on the table, and you heat it up, it's like 25 degrees, and then 26, 27, 28, 29, still nothing has happened. You got that ice cube there, 30, 31. But then you go from 31 to 32 degrees, and suddenly you hit this phase transition and the ice cube melts. And a lot of the time, making 1% improvements or building small habits is kind of like that process where you're putting effort in. You're like, I've gone to the gym for 3 months in a row, or, I keep making sales calls. I've been doing this for 6 months. Like, why am I not seeing results yet? But in a sense, complaining about working for 3 months or 6 months or a year and not having the outcome you want is kind of like complaining about heating an ice cube from 25 to 31 degrees. Like, the work was not wasted, it's just being stored. And so often you need to get through that plateau of latent potential to get to that phase transition. And it's a hallmark of any compounding process. All of the greatest returns are delayed. Before you hit the hockey stick, you're just kind of in this little valley of death. And it's important it's important to understand that, so you know what you're going through, but it can be hard and difficult when you're in the moment. And so you need to find ways to make your habits easier so that you can continue to show up on those days when it doesn't feel easy.
I heard Gary, he said sometimes we're succeeding so slowly, we feel like we're failing.
Yeah,
You're
that's
doing the right
exactly it.
activity, but it's the success is so slow that it feels like failure. So what do? We go and try to do everything else, and we end up failing so slowly, we think we're succeeding.
Yeah, there's a great quote by Machiavelli where he says something to the effect of, men desire novelty to such a degree that even those who are doing well crave it as much as those who are doing poorly. And so it's like you're succeeding slowly, but it's so slow that you're like, oh no, I must try something new, right? There must be a faster way to get in shape or a better business idea.
Yeah.
And so then you just jump to the next thing, and it just becomes this endless cycle of hopping from one strategy to the next.
Yeah. So you mentioned making it easier, and I know we had talked a little bit about things that you can do to make your environment support your goal of forming that habit. Walk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, so there are many ways to build better habits. One of my favorite strategies is what I would call environment design. And the thing that environment design or good choice architecture does is that it makes two very important phases of building a habit easier. So the first thing is you can't build a habit if you don't think about it, if you don't remember it in the beginning. Now, of course, the goal is that you're doing it so easily, so automatically that you don't have to think about it. But when you're establishing it, oftentimes people just forget. So as a very personal example or easy example, for my whole life, I would brush my teeth in the morning and at night, but I would always struggle to stick with flossing consistently. And so I think you can follow a similar process for dealing with pretty much any habit, which is you map out every little choice or action that needs to happen as part of that behavior. And so I looked at flossing and I was like, all right, what needs to occur for me to do this? So first, I realized I would just forget to do it a lot of the time because the floss was in the drawer in the bathroom. Like I just wouldn't see it. And so I wouldn't remember. A second thing, it sounds kind of silly, but I didn't really like the feeling of the floss wrapping around my fingers. I was just like, I don't know, it was kind of annoying. It tugged or whatever. It was uncomfortable. So what I did was I bought some of the pre-made flossers and I got a little bowl and I put the bowl right next to my toothbrush and then put the flossers inside of it. So as soon as I finished brushing my teeth, put the toothbrush down, pick the flosser up, done. And that little environment change was basically all I needed. Now I've been doing it twice a day for years, and all I really needed to do was just shift how the environment was shaped. You can say something similar for breaking bad habits. So, for example, a lot of people will, play too many video games or watch too much TV, spend too much time staring at the screen. But if you walk into pretty much any living room, where do all the couches and chairs face? Like they all face the television. So it's like, what is this room designed to get you to do? So there are varying degrees of change that you could employ here. You could, for example, take a chair and turn it so it's not facing the television. You could take the remote control and put it inside a coffee table or a drawer and put a book in its place. You could take the TV and put it inside like a wall unit or a cabinet so that you don't see it as often. And all of this is to try to reduce exposure. But you could also increase the friction associated with like performing the action of watching television. So you could you could take the batteries out of the remote so that it takes an extra 10 seconds to get the TV started each time. And that might be just enough time for you to think, do I actually want to watch something or am I just mindlessly turning this on? Or you could unplug the TV after each use and then only plug it back in if you can say the name of the TV show that you want to watch. So again, just trying to cut away mindless browsing. And then the final option, I mean, if you really want to be extreme about it, you could take the TV off the wall and put it in the closet and only take it out if you really wanted to watch something. But the point here is that imagine if you lived in an environment where, similar to the flossing habit, the good behaviors were obvious and easy. And similar to the television example, the bad behaviors were less obvious or maybe even invisible sometimes. And the friction of doing those tasks was increased. BJ Fogg, he's a professor at Stanford. And he's written a lot of great things about habits. He has a good example, I think, that kind of encapsulates this, which is he liked eating popcorn, but he just didn't want to eat as much of it. And so he took popcorn out of his pantry, walked into the garage and climbed up a ladder and put it on the highest shelf in the garage. Now, if he really wants it, he can just go out and get it. It's only going to take 60 seconds. But if he's designing the environment for his lazy decision, for his default action, he's not going to go get the popcorn. And so how can you reduce the number of steps between you and the good behaviors and increase the number of steps between you and the bad ones so that your environment is primed for better default actions. I think that's one really effective way to build better habits.
Mm, I know Jay Papasan is on day 91 of a 66-day challenge to breaking the habit of Amazon one-click purchasing. Because he finds himself just browsing and one click purchase. And so for 91 days now, if there's something he really wants to buy on Amazon, he can put it in the cart, but then he has to close the browser. And if he really wants it, he can come back the next day and purchase it. And for 91 days, he has not just impulsively bought something on Amazon.
Yeah, that's great. I find that that almost always when I make an impulse purchase on Amazon, it's for books. And so what I've started to do is there's an option to send a free sample to your Kindle. And so instead of buying it, my rule is I have to send a free sample first, and then I read a little bit of it, which of course the same thing ends up happening, which used to happen with books, which is I would just buy them on impulse and then not get around to reading them. So now I'm just not getting around to reading the free samples, which is of course much better for my bank account. But I like Jay's approach there is a good one, which is that you can kind of create little rules for yourself that increase the space between you and the action. So like, another common Amazon one is you're allowed to buy something, but you have to wait more than 24 hours. So like I have a friend, a reader who will say like whenever he's getting ready to make a purchase, he'll say something like, can I wait one more day? And so you add to the cart and then you just wait, and then you could review it at the end of each week. And what you find is half the stuff you put in there you didn't actually want or need to begin with, but kind of felt like you wanted it in the moment. But you can do that same kind of rule setting for pretty much any habit. It doesn't just have to be finance stuff. Like one of my favorite ones is say you're drinking too much soda. You can say, well, I'm allowed to have a soda, but I'll only drink soda after I drink a glass of water. So again, you're just trying to like increase the space, and you find that half the time you were just thirsty, and once you have the water, you don't really need the soda anyway. But if you want it afterward, then that's fine. Go ahead and drink it. So it's a little more, you don't have to feel as guilty about it, but it like creates enough space that you avoid the bad habit.
When it comes to habit formation, Winston asked the question, if you fall off the wagon, do you have to start over? So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, so it depends on when you fall off the wagon. So first of all, I should just say that, I mean, you guys do your 66-day challenges, and I've talked about habit streaks and staying consistent before as well. And repetition is what builds a habit. So you need to have a streak going. But the true and the honest answer is that every streak ends at some point. I mean, when I was building jamesclear.com, I wrote a new article every Monday and Thursday for 3 years. But at some point, that streak ended. And so the mantra that I like to keep in mind is never miss twice. It's almost never the first mistake that ruins you. It's like the spiral of repeated mistakes that follows. So it's really when you get locked into this like all or nothing mindset, and you think, oh, I fell off course with my writing habit, or I binge ate with my friends. Now I'm not following the diet anymore. Guess I'm not made to do this. And so then you just use that as an excuse to not get back on track. But I think exactly the opposite approach is the one that's much more productive and useful in the long run. The technical scientific answer is interesting as well, which is that there are these things called learning curves that researchers look at, and essentially it maps out, it's kind of like a curve that starts steep in the beginning and then tapers off at the end. And when you build a habit, it looks just like that learning curve. And this is also true for memory or for learning a new skill or a fact. In the beginning, as you repeat it, you get better and better at recalling it or at doing it automatically. And then at some point, it becomes about as automatic as it's going to get. And even if you keep repeating it, it doesn't get really any easier. You're kind of at your maximum fluency or skill. However, there are also what they call forgetting curves. And I haven't written about this yet, but I have an article that I've been kind of putting together on it. And basically, the idea is as you are building a habit, you're crawling up that learning curve. The forgetting curve is kind of the inverse of it. So as soon as you stop doing a habit, you forget more of it, or more of the fluency of that skill faster in the beginning. And so it drops very steeply, and then it tapers off again at the end. So you can think of it like this. It might be interesting to think about with like a fact or a school thing. So early on, you go to a class and then you leave. Within an hour, you've already forgot, say, half of the things that you were told. Within another day, maybe you forget another half of that remainder. And then within 2 days, you forget a half of that 25% that's left. But then at some point you've kind of like you've tapered off, and whatever you're going to remember from that hour, you're not forgetting at this point. It's like locked in. So I would say that habits are kind of similar in that way. Once you've built them, there maybe is a certain degree that you're not going to forget. But if you adhere to that methodology or that philosophy of never miss twice, you're going to be able to climb that curve back much more quickly and be back to your fluent self that you were before.
I'll share from my personal experience. I am currently on my 4th attempt at forming the habit of thinking time. This came out of the podcast episode we did with Keith Cunningham on the habit that cost $100 million to learn and why it was worth it. And 3 times, I mean, I got 45 days in, and then just something happened. Life got in the way, and I fast forward and realized a week went by and I didn't even realize it. And I remember asking myself the question, did I just forget a few days, or do I really need to start over? And I basically realized, you know what, you got to start over. You're not anywhere close to this. And now I'm on my 4th try, which today was day 14. So I'm sticking with it because it matters. But I think it's less about being committed to actually locking it in and making it a habit. And I think you can assess whether or not you feel like you should start over, or if you earn the right to keep going.
So some of this is semantics to a little degree, but it can provide like an important insight into this process, which is that if we're speaking about a habit technically, a habit is a behavior that can be performed more or less automatically. If it's something that requires effortful thought, so for example, you might say something like, I want to get in the habit of writing each day. But writing is about as effortful as it gets. I mean, it requires a lot of thinking to come up with, to write something decent. So it's never just going to be done automatically. Like, you're consciously thinking and deliberately thinking during the whole process. So I would call those types of behaviors more like a routine or a ritual. But the key is that they can work together. So I think the way to utilize habits is as an entry point to your rituals and routines. So if you can automate the first 2 minutes of the behavior, then you make it as easy as possible to get started, to get motivated, and you can do that automatically. And then you just find yourself working, you find yourself typing, and then the effortful work of writing begins. But I mean, that's something I call the 2-minute rule. You basically take whatever habit is that you want to build and you scale it down to just the first 2 minutes, and then you pour all of your energy into mastering that. And then once you've done that, then you have a lot of options. Then you can, continue.
So I love that, because it is so aligned with you're thinking big, being the type of person who writes every day, has a deep thinking time block, whatever it may be. And then you're going really small. What's that 2-inch domino, that thing that I can knock over the first 2 minutes, that if I just did that would make the remainder of it easier or unnecessary? What's an example of how you've done that in your life?
Well, so sometimes I refer to these as like decisive moments, but and most people probably have maybe, I don't know, 5 or 10 that happen throughout the day. So for example, there's one each night. It's like around 5:15 p.m. My wife will get home from work, and there's this decisive moment where either we change into our workout clothes and we go to the gym, or we sit on the couch and watch The Office or order takeout or something. And it's really about what happens in those first 2 minutes that determine the next like 2 hours. If we change into our workout clothes, like everything else is already decided. We're going to drive to the gym. I'll get under the bar. We'll do the workout like that. It all is just going to happen. So it's really about that decisive moment. There's another one for me in the morning where like I'll go down to my office and I'll either open up Evernote and start writing the next article that I'm working on, or I'll go to ESPN and check sports news for the next like 45 minutes. And what happens over that next hour is really about what happens in the first like 2 minutes of me sitting down. So what I like to keep in mind with that is there's not actually that much to master. It's really just about mastering that decisive moment, or those first 2 minutes. So some of the things that I like to recommend are, sometimes this will, I guess I should say, from a high level, people have heard stuff like this before, right? They've heard like, oh, you should start small or something like that. But even when you know that you should start small, it's still very easy to start too big. Like you might say something like, okay, I want to go for a run. I want to start running 3 days a week. I want to build a habit of running. But I know that I should start small, so I'm only going to run for 15 minutes. But even that is actually way too big. What I'm talking about is you scale it down to those first 2 minutes. You tie your running shoes and you step out the door, and that's the habit. And if anything else happens after that, then it's just a bonus. And that sounds silly to people at the start because they're like, well, obviously this is a mental trick, right? Like I know the real goal isn't to just put my running shoes on. I know the real goal is to go for a run. But if you feel that way, my suggestion would be to limit yourself to only be able to do that. So for example, I had a reader, he ended up losing over 100 pounds. And one of the ways that he did it was that he went to the gym, but he set a rule for himself where he wasn't allowed to stay for longer than 5 minutes. So he would show up, he'd go to the gym, he did this for like 6 straight weeks. He'd do an exercise or so, and then it'd get to be 5 minutes and he would leave. And it's the exact opposite of how most people try to get in shape. But what he was doing, what you realize about it, is that he's mastering the art of showing up. And the key thing about a habit is that it has to be established before it can be improved. If you don't optimize like for the starting line and show up each day, if you don't master the art of showing up, there's nothing to optimize. There's nothing to go from there. So most people, they get really motivated and they decide to join a CrossFit gym or do P90X or Insanity or some crazy thing. And they do that for a few days or a couple weeks, and then they burn out. And then, they wait 3 more months until the cycle repeats itself again. But he was saying, all right, how do I become the type of person that shows up at the gym every day? And now it's like, well, I know I'm going to be here, so I might as well start doing something a little better. The other thing that scaling a habit down to those first 2 minutes does, which is really helpful, is that there are all these logistical details associated with building a habit that nobody thinks about. When you start building a habit, everybody thinks about the outcome. They think like, all right, I want to lose 20 pounds in the next 6 months, or I want to earn 6 figures next year, or I want to write a best-selling book or learn a language or whatever. It's all about the result. But there are all these details associated with getting to that final outcome that people overlook. So like if you take my reader example of going to the gym, okay, great, you want to work out. What gym will you go to? What time will you go there? Will you go before or after work? What route are you going to take? Are you going to meet a friend there, or are you going to go on your own? Do they have a water fountain at the gym, or do you need to bring a water bottle? Do you have to get your clothes together before you go to the gym and pack your gym bag, or can you come home and then change? And like some of those things sound silly, but the difference between, oh, I always forget to bring my water bottle and they don't have a water fountain there, like that's enough to get people to quit sometimes. And if you're just focused on the first 2 minutes and mastering the art of showing up, then you get to figure all that stuff out. And then once you've figured it out and you're not intimidated by it anymore, then you have the chance to improve and expand and upgrade from there.
Yeah. How many people who are listening to this, have you ever been in the situation where you really wanted to make a change? You really wanted to establish that habit, and you simply set the bar too high. I'm gonna exercise for an hour every single day, and you do 40 minutes. How do you feel? You missed your goal. You probably feel like a failure. And the next day you do 45 minutes, you feel like a failure. The next day you do 50, you feel like a failure. The next day you do 30, you feel like a failure. And what we find is that people only allow themselves to feel like a failure for so long before they rewrite the rules of the game so they don't feel like a failure, usually by quitting or by just lowering the goal. And so how can you give yourself permission from the front end, like James is talking about, that first 2 minutes just to get started? We'll call it a 2-inch domino that you can knock over. Sure, putting on your shoes and tying your laces and getting out the door is not, that single thing alone will not give you washboard abs. Yet does it make going for a run easier? Sure does. And that's what we're talking about, those little 1% over time that lead to extraordinary results.
I think sometimes people wonder why I chose the phrase atomic habits for the book. And
I was wondering that.
What's that?
I was wondering that.
It has multiple meanings. So the word atomic, it can mean small, like atom. And obviously, we've been talking about this so far. I think your habits should be easy. So that is part of it. But the other meaning of atomic is that it's the fundamental unit of a larger system. So atoms build into molecules, molecules build into compounds, and so on. And I say this in the conclusion of Atomic Habits, which is that the holy grail of habit change is not a single 1% improvement. It's 1,000 of them. And so you're not actually looking to just do one small thing or to wrap everything up in like one outcome. You're looking to create a collection of little 1% changes that are all organized towards the same final goal. Kind of like adding, it's like adding 1,000 grains of sand to one side of the scale until it starts to tip in your favor. And that, I think, is a way to think about these little 2% or 2-minute rule or 1% improvements, is that They're easy to do, but when you add them all up, they can lead to a really remarkable result.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Talk about, you said you don't believe that people rise to the level of goals; they fall to the levels of their systems. How do we go about establishing a system for creating good habits and breaking bad habits?
It's a great question. I mean, I think it's an essential question to consider. Really, if you think about it just from a high level, whatever whatever results you're getting right now, your current life is perfectly designed to deliver your current results. Your current system is perfectly designed to deliver your current results. So if you want different results, what you need is a different system. And I would say that, the same way that I just mentioned, atoms are built into molecules. Habits are sort of like the atoms of our lives in the sense that they're these little routines and patterns that we do each day, and they all kind of build up together to form the larger system. And so the way to build a better system is to create better habits, to slowly adjust those. But the question that we need to ask ourselves is it comes down to a difference that I call outcome-based habits versus identity-based habits. So this, I think, is where we get into how to shape the system, or how to understand where we should focus our effort. So most of the time, when people go about trying to change something, they would build what I would call as an outcome-based habit. They think about the outcome they want, earning more money or losing weight or being more productive or whatever. And then they come up with a plan for achieving that outcome. So they say, here's the goal, here's my plan for achieving that goal. And usually the conversation stops there. But I would say that there's a deeper layer of behavior change, which is what I would call your identity. So the set of beliefs and biases, this sense of self-image that you have, that underlies or is behind every behavior. And the point is not that that outcomes are better than identity, or identity is better than outcomes, or anything like that. The point is the direction of change. Most of the time, people start with the outcome and let that drive the plan, and then whoever they end up being as a result of that is who they are. I think it's more useful to reverse the process. Start with the identity. So who is the type of person that I want to be? Who is the type of person that could achieve this result? Let that inform the habits, and then whatever the result is, it comes naturally. So, for example, if you want to write a best-selling book, well, who is the type of person who could write a best-selling book? Well, maybe it's the type of person who writes at least one sentence every day. And so then you focus on building the identity of being the type of person who writes every day. And then once you have that habit, then you can have whatever result comes from it. Or maybe the outcome you want is to lose 20 pounds. Well, who's the type of person that could lose 20 pounds? Well, maybe it's the type of person who doesn't miss workouts. So now you're focused on building the identity of someone who doesn't miss workouts. And I think the beauty of that approach is that it clarifies the system, so that you don't have to wait to get to the result that you want. Every time you sit down to write a sentence, or every time you go to the gym, you are embodying that identity. And habits are like the method through which you embody a certain identity or sense of self-image. So, every time you clean your room or make your bed, you're embodying the identity of being a clean and organized person. Every time you study Chinese for 20 minutes, you're embodying the identity of someone who's studious. Every time you go to the gym, you're embodying the identity of someone who's fit. And it's kind of like every action you take is a vote for the type of person that you want to become. And if you cast enough votes, you start to shift the identity and start to believe it about yourself. And that's like a really powerful place to be. It's a much more affirming place to be than to keep saying, oh, I just wish I had this outcome, but I'm not there yet.
We've seen this with goal setting. Gary was teaching a mastermind, and he asked the audience, what's the purpose of a goal? And so many people said something along the lines of to achieve result. And he said, that's interesting. He said, I believe that the purpose of a goal is to be appropriate in the moment. It's not about the result. It's about who's the person you become. How do you show up as the most appropriate version of yourself right now? And when you realize that goal achievement is less about the result, but more about the evolution of you as a human, lets a lot of the stress off.
I mean, this is one of the core reasons why I really think habits matter. It's true that habits can lead to better productivity, or to help you lose weight, or achieve whatever those goals are. But the real thing that habits do is they shape your sense of self. By embodying that person, they give you a reason to believe that about yourself. And it's one thing to say that I want this. It's something very different to say I am this. And that's in a sense, you're not even really looking for behavior change at that point, because you're just already acting like the person you believe that you are.
Right.
The example that I give is that you imagine two people who are trying to quit smoking. So with one person, you give them a cigarette and they say, or you offer them a cigarette and they say, oh, no, thanks, I'm trying to quit. And then with the second person, you offer them a cigarette and they say, oh, no, thanks, I'm not a smoker. And it's the same thing. They're both turning down the cigarette, but the first person still identifies as someone who smokes and they're trying to be something else. The second person doesn't identify as a smoker anymore. They don't see themselves in that way. And it becomes much easier to stick to whatever behavior you're trying to build if you see that as the type of thing that you do, as something that aligns with your identity rather than conflicts with it. If it conflicts with your identity, you're going to come up with all kinds of reasons to self-sabotage the plan.
So we're coming back to, we don't rise to our goals, we fall to our systems. And I'm hearing you say that as a foundation to whatever system you have in place is recognizing it's less about the outcome or the result and more about identity, the type of person that you are. So what's one thing that someone can do that would make shaping that identity easier or unnecessary?
So in the book, I lay out what I call the 4 laws of behavior change. And the way that you can think of them is they're kind of like 4 different levers. And sometimes the levers are in the right positions for building habits, and sometimes they're in the wrong positions. And depending on the habit that you're facing or the circumstance you're in, there might be a different lever to pull to make it easier or more likely that you'll stick to the habit that you want to build. So it's kind of like a toolbox, and you can choose what tools you want to use. We don't have time to go over all 4 of them right now, but the one that I think is really crucial is the 4th law of behavior change, which is make it satisfying. And make it satisfying plays an important role for any habit because when the ending of a habit is satisfying, we have like a positive emotional signal, a reason to repeat it again in the future. It's kind of like it tells your brain, hey, that felt good. Like you should do this again next time when the circumstances are similar. But if you don't have that, then you don't really have much of a reason to do it again. One way to think about this, and it kind of illuminates the distinction between what a good habit is and what a bad habit is that every behavior produces multiple outcomes across time. So, if you have a behavior like eating a donut, the immediate outcome is favorable. It's tasty, it's sugary, it feels good, it's sweet. The ultimate outcome is that you gain weight a month from now. Something like going to the gym, the immediate outcome is actually in some cases unfavorable, right? You sweat, it takes sacrifice and effort, it's hard. The ultimate outcome that you're fit a month from now is great. So part of the battle between these two is that the immediate outcome is what often drives the behavior. This is something in the book, I call this the cardinal rule of behavior change, which is behaviors that are immediately rewarded get repeated, behaviors that are immediately punished get avoided. And so you can see the challenge here because often our bad habits provide a favorable outcome in the moment, which is what drives the behavior, and an unfavorable outcome only later. Whereas good habits require you to delay gratification, and the favorable outcome is not until down the line. So much of the battle here is to figure out a way to pull the consequences of your bad habits into the moment to make them unsatisfying right when you do them, and to pull the rewards or the benefits of your good habits into the present moment so they're satisfying and you have a reason to repeat them again while you're waiting for the long-term rewards to show up. A lot of the time, the benefit of going to the gym for a month isn't really a whole lot. Like your body hasn't changed that much. The scale is more or less the same. Maybe it's moved 3 or 5 pounds or something. But you need something to get you through that kind of valley of death there while you're waiting for the long-term rewards to show up. So there are a couple ways that you can do this. The first way that you can do it is with an external reward, some kind of what psychologists call a reinforcement. One example that I really liked, I have a reader of mine, he and his wife were trying to cook more meals together. They wanted to spend less money going out to eat on dinner, and they wanted to cook more, be healthier. So they decided to set up a savings account, and they just created an online savings account and gave it the name Trip to Europe. That's what they labeled the account. And every time that they would stay at home and cook a meal, they would move $50 over to the account, and because they didn't spend it going out to eat. And then at the end of the year, they had whatever built up there, and they were able to spend it on the vacation. And methods like that are really useful for what I would call habits of avoidance, because habits of avoidance, like don't drink alcohol for 30 days, or don't go out to eat, or Jay's example of don't make one-click purchases on Amazon. it's really hard to feel satisfied in the moment when you do those things, because all you're really doing is just resisting temptation. So you need something that can provide that positive emotional signal where you feel good, you feel like, oh, this was a successful choice. And moving $50 over to the account, or $5 or whatever it is one example of doing that. So external reinforcers are good, but I would say that the ultimate form of immediate gratification, or adding some kind of instant satisfaction to any habit, is a reaffirmment or reinforcing of your identity. So if you feel like every time you go to the gym, you're casting a vote for being the type of person who doesn't miss workouts, you have a reason to enjoy that moment, even if you're suffering during the workout, because you're reaffirming your desired identity. And perhaps the most powerful version of this is when you layer them both on top of each other, and you're getting maybe an external reinforcer for a little while, and you're like, hey, and I'm becoming the type of person I want to be. But if you add those two things, then you have a reason to feel successful in the moment, and thus a reason to repeat the habit in the future.
So go a little more specific, because I love the idea of in the moment reinforcing the identity. Is that simply a matter of looking in the mirror and going, I'm the type of person who exercises every day? Or what can someone do following this training to start doing that?
Well, there are a lot of ways to do this. Businesses, for example, will build some kind of satisfaction into the product that isn't even necessary for the product itself. It's literally just there to get you to feel good when you repeat it. So, for example, toothpaste is a very common example. There's no reason toothpaste needs to have a mint flavor. It's literally just to make you have like this clean mouth feel. It doesn't make toothpaste more effective. It just makes you more satisfied when you use it. I recently heard a great one. Car companies, I think it was Ford in particular, they are adding a secondary, or fake, I guess we could call it, guttural roar to their trucks when you press the accelerator, so that it's more satisfying to accelerate above and beyond what the engine would produce itself. So again, you get this immediate feedback that is more pleasurable in the moment. But when it comes to identity, I think that you can reaffirm it by writing it down or talking to yourself in the mirror or whatever. I usually don't recommend strategies like that just because I find them cheesy personally, but I'm not saying it couldn't work.
I really thought you were going to be one of those great self-talk guys.
Yeah. Sorry. But I think that ultimately what happens with identity and when it becomes a reinforcer, and this is kind of what makes my theory a little different than sometimes you'll hear people say things like, oh, just fake it till you make it, or something like that. I actually think that's the opposite, or different, at least from what I'm talking about, which is that the reason we believe in a particular identity is only because you have evidence of it. And so doing it each time casts a vote for that identity and builds up evidence. And so once you've accumulated enough votes or accumulated enough evidence, then you have reason to actually believe it. If you fake it till you make it and just believe something but don't have evidence for it, you might be able to maintain that for a day or a week or a little while. But after a while, what that becomes is delusion. The brain does not like holding a belief that it doesn't have evidence for. There's this conflict there. It feels like you're just faking yourself out. So another way to do this, to add a little bit of immediate reinforcement and to instantly remind yourself of your desired identity, is to utilize what I call habit tracking. And this can be a really effective way because it makes the identity visual. So, the most simple version is just putting an X on each day of the calendar that you do it. Yep. But it doesn't have to be an X on the calendar. There are many ways to track a habit. There are many ways to track behavior. I mean, the page numbers in a book track how far along you are in the book. But imagine that you do that every day that you study a new language, you put an X on the calendar after you've studied for 10 minutes or whatever it is. Well, if you look back on that at the end of the month, or even a couple weeks in, and you've got, say, 10 X's on there out of the last 14 days, well, you have evidence that you have been adhering to that identity, right? You got an example here?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously we have a 66-day challenge calendar, but one of the things that we realized, we're in the process of coming out with the One Thing Planner, which will be out later this year, which for those of you, if you want to get on the wait list for this, go to onething.com/planner with the number one. But when we sat down with our members and we asked what would bring the most value to you, and they said the habit of priority. And how do you really bring that to fruition? And one of the things that we did is we just put at the top of every single day a blank space for them to write their one thing. every day, whether it be personal or professional, and to the right of it is a domino. And every day that you do your one thing, you get to cross that domino off. And what's interesting is that you can look at your month at a glance and actually see how many days out of the month did I really have clarity on what my one thing was. And of those days, did I actually get it done? And that's, I mean, that's for you individually. What does that look like with your team inside an organization? And we've already gotten amazing feedback from it, but it's just that ability to easily and quickly see your progress.
My dad does this with, I mean, he goes swimming 5 or 6 days a week, and at the end of the month, he'll show me his calendar where he's got it, each day crossed off that he goes and swims. And it's a way of taking the invisible and making it visible. It's a way of taking this concept of who am I, how have I shown up, and proving to yourself that this is the identity that you have. And I personally, I think that that's much more powerful than fake it till you make it, because you have evidence, you have a reason to believe in that identity. So that I think is probably the, I don't know if I'll call it the best, but it's a very effective way to reaffirm that identity in the moment and give yourself a reason to stick with it in the long run.
I will say consistent exercise is something that I have struggled with. And since I started using the one thing planner, one of the things I do is on the days that I exercise, I put a little E with a circle around it, and starting to string those together just to see from a month at a glance view, how many days did I really get my exercise in, and how am I doing against my goal for the month, and all those things. Just like you said, it's very apparent, it's visual.
This is a good place to tie in something we talked about earlier, which is if you're going to be tracking your habits like this, it's also the perfect time to keep that mantra of never miss twice in mind, which, you get that streak going, you got 4, 5, 6, 7 days in a row, and then you miss one. You pour all of your energy into making sure you get an X on the next day, that you can cross off that thing and start the new streak. Because, if you let that compound and drift, then all of a sudden you turn around and it's been 2 months since you've done the habit.
Yeah, I just love that what you're saying. It's so focused on the start, not the whole thing, beginning. You miss a day, pour all your energy and just get back on the bandwagon the next day.
In a lot of ways, habits are just an exercise in getting started each day. If you get started each day, then it is a habit. You did it each time. So really, it's not that you shouldn't think about results or you should never reassess and reflect and review whether you're getting the outcomes that you want. But if you're focused on the process and on delivering, it's really all about the start.
Yeah, I love it. What have been some of the most powerful habits that you have acquired, James?
Well, so I like to put habits into basically 2 categories. So the first category are habits that are, I guess I'll just call them like basic life skills or fundamentals, things that you build and then you don't really need to think about them again, like tying your shoes or brushing your teeth or unplugging the toaster after each time you use it, or whatever all the little habits are that people have. I don't really need a process of continuous improvement for that. Like good enough is good enough. I don't need a process for endlessly refining my shoe tying technique or something like that. But then there's a second category, which are things that you are interested in continuously improving, that you feel like you do want to refine and master and kind of make it your craft. And for me, I would say there's maybe 2 or 3 of those. So there's writing, which is kind of the backbone or engine of my business. There's weightlifting and training, and then there's travel photography, which is just kind of like a passion of mine. So I do want to get better at those 3 things. I am interested in not just staying at my current level. And for that category, my approach is different. For the first category, the stuff that the daily habits, I'm just doing stuff like the environment design thing that we talked about previously. Like, how can I prime the environment, make it as easy as possible for me to do this stuff and to not have to think about it? How can I just automate it? For the other stuff, I have a more careful structure. So the main thing is, I just want to show up. So everything we've talked about is relevant. But because I want to refine and review, I also have a process for reflection and review for those habits. So the 2 things that I do at the end of each year, I have an annual review where I ask myself, what went well this year, what didn't go well this year, and then what is my plan going forward. And that's a chance for me to do kind of some like longer term measurement. So I will measure how many workouts I did over the course of the year, and also how many workouts I did each month, and then what my average was this year versus the year prior. I'll measure how many articles I published, and again, how many each month, and then like if I wanted to make any adjustments there. I track how many new states that I've been to and new countries that I've gone to, because like I mentioned, travel photography is that's like kind of a central piece of that. And then at the end of that process, I kind of have a good idea of like where I stand from that year. 6 months later in the summer, I conduct what I call an integrity report. And during that report, I also have 3 questions. I ask myself, what are my core values? So what are the principles and values that I say that I'm going to live by? The second question is, how have I lived by those values? So it's kind of a chance to pat myself on my back and, you know, say like what's gone well. And then the third question is really the important one, which is where have I fallen down and not lived up to those principles in the last year? And the key thing about that process is that integrity is something that everybody thinks that they have. And it's only when you like let it slip a little bit and you make these just this once decisions, like, well, normally that wouldn't stick with my principles, but this time it's different. When you do that and you never course correct, you end up in a very different place 2 or 5 or 10 years later. And so the purpose of the integrity report is kind of to pull me back to center. I mean, I make mistakes like everybody else, but I need that process of reflection and review to make sure that my identity, the core values and principles that I believe in, is staying on track. And then I can use the results from the annual review to see if my habits are matching up with those values. So it's basically the same strategies for building the habit. There's just a different process in the back end for refining it.
Very cool. Very cool. It's been one of the discoveries we've had this year, that power of purposeful reflection. Jay discovered it going through his own process. We discovered it doing our mid-year reset retreat and then incorporating it into the planner. It's just, it's interesting. As goal-oriented people, we're often so forward-focusing that we forget to slow down, stop, and actually look backwards and ask how things went and what changes we can make.
Right.
And that's the path of
It's
mastery.
kind of like that Peter Drucker quote where like there's nothing so useless as doing something effectively that didn't need to be done at all. And a lot of the time people who are productive are they're very efficient, but if they're not reviewing and reflecting enough, they just get efficient at all the stuff they shouldn't be doing.
I make a joke with one of the women in our office and I go, how does it feel to be the best meeting attender in the entire company? You must feel awesome. She can't say no. She can't say no. So James, where can people learn more about you and Atomic Habits?
Sure. Well, thank you again for the opportunity. So the book is Atomic Habits, an easy and proven way to build good habits and break bad ones. You can find it at atomichabits.com. And also there are a variety of additional bonuses and downloads and things like that. So we have a couple of chapters that did not make it into the final book, bonus chapters that can be downloaded, a few exercises and templates, and then also like a cheat sheet of how to build good habits and break bad ones with kind of all the actionable ideas listed out. And yeah, so atomichabits.com is the best place to go.
Awesome. Mary had a question. Can you repeat the last second step in your integrity check-in, please?
Yeah, so the first step is what are my values and how do I live by them? Or what are my core values? What are the principles and values that are important to me? The second question is how have I been living by those values this year? And then the third one is where have I fallen down and have missed living by those principles?
Okay.
And then I saw someone else in here who asked to repeat the cardinal rule of behavior change, which is behaviors that are immediately rewarded get repeated, behaviors that are immediately punished get avoided. And it's really about the speed. It's really about how quickly you feel successful or unsuccessful. There's some interesting research on criminal activity that shows that the thing that deters crimes the best is not super severe punishments, although those will help, but the speed of the punishment. So if someone knows they're going to be apprehended like a minute after they try to rob a bank, they just won't bother doing it. But if they know that they can get away with it for a while and there's like a chance of, hey, maybe they won't know for 6 months, then like I don't know, I guess they end up convincing themselves maybe they'll get away with it. So it's more about the speed of the punishment than the severity.
Oh, that's interesting. Made me just think about my kids.
Well, if you think about it, I mean, people say this with dogs all the time when you're training them that, if the dog goes to the bathroom in the house, but then you don't catch it for like an hour, it doesn't help that much to reprimand them then because there's been too much space between the action and the response. There's a gap in the feedback. Same thing is true for, we do this all the time in our schools. It's a little bit weird, but like you take a test and then you don't find out if you have the right answer or not for like 2 weeks. Compare that to if you were asked the question, gave the answer, and then immediately heard back whether it was right or wrong. The tighter the feedback loop, the faster the learning. And that's true for habits and behaviors, as well as facts and education, and apparently getting your dog to go to the bathroom outside. But it's much easier to learn when the feedback is tighter.
Yeah, I love that. What other questions for you, the live audience, do you have? We got about 5 minutes left with James, and then we are going to wrap it. Can you dive through as well, Kailyn? Cool. James, what's one question that we haven't asked you that we'd be remiss if we didn't ask?
Well, one thing that people often overlook that I think is very important to discuss when it comes to building habits is the power of the social environment. People kind of know it implicitly that like, oh yeah, the people I'm around shift my habits and behaviors. But what I want to point out is that everybody is part of multiple tribes or circles. So you're part of very large tribes, like being an American or being French or being a Christian or being a Muslim or being Buddhist or whatever. Like there are these very big buckets. And then there are very small buckets, like being part of your local CrossFit gym or the office that you go to work at or the volunteer organization that you hang out with or your neighbors that are on your street. And all of these tribes have their own social norms associated with them. They have their own kind of expectations. And society leans heavily on us all. We want to adhere to the social norms that are attractive and praised within our particular tribes. Like pretty much everybody stops at stop signs, or when you go into an elevator, you turn around to face the front, or when you have a job interview, you wear a suit and a tie or a dress. Like there's no reason you have to do that. You could go to a job interview in a bathing suit. You could face the back of an elevator. You could roll through stop signs. But the reason that you don't is because everybody else expects it. And so it becomes, this is something that the second law of behavior change that I mentioned, which is make it attractive. Behaviors are attractive when they align with our social norms, with the groups that we're in. They're very unattractive when they conflict with the social norms. And so the key here is to find the right tribes so that find a group where your desired behavior is the normal behavior. Because if it's the normal behavior, then you have a really strong reason to repeat it. Because if you want to remain friends with these people, if you want to remain part of the tribe, then you need to do the thing that they're doing. And you can see this on pretty much any level. Like, if you start hanging out with jazz musicians all the time, then playing jazz every day becomes like a very normal habit. It's like, hey, this is what everybody else is doing. If I want to be friends with them, that's what I do too. And you can use that to your advantage, but oftentimes it also conflicts. So you need to think carefully about what tribes and groups you're part of and which behaviors and habits are attractive in that particular group.
Yeah, I would ask you who's listening or watching, where is your tribe currently not reflective of the person you want to become?
If there's a conflict between your desired identity and the tribes that you belong to, it's going to be hard because you're going to feel like you're fighting an uphill battle, like you're going against the grain all the time. Yeah. And I think the key thing is you can, sometimes people say, well, you need to fire your friends or get new friends or change, like whatever. And that can be really, the closer that gets, the harder that is to do, right? It's really hard to leave family members or to leave friends that you've been with for a long time. But it's particularly difficult if the choice is, do I stay part of this tribe or do I end up alone? So what you need is to have a place to go. You need a new tribe to join, a new set of friends to develop, because then at least you're changing tribes. You're not left alone. Being left alone, when choosing between the option of doing something that you would like to do and being alone versus being wrong or doing something you don't want to do and being together, a lot of the time people would rather be wrong with the crowd than right by themselves. And so you need a group where you can transition to a tribe, another group of friends where you can be right there.
Yeah. Well, I would strongly support it. I mean, that was the main decision behind us creating a community behind the one thing, which if you guys are interested, if you feel like your environment doesn't really support your goals and you just need a tribe that actually understands what it's like to live this, if you go to theonething.com/training and you'll see living your one thing there, check it out. It's very worth it. And James, looking forward to the book coming out. Folks, pick up a copy at atomichabits.com. A replay will be sent out after this, as well as this will out on the One Thing podcast. So if you are not yet subscribed to the show, find it on your podcast player of choice, click the subscribe button. It'll automatically be delivered when it goes out. Thanks again, James.
Awesome. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Have a good one.